Okay, Sombra, where's my reset button?
Holy mackerel!
What?
Stale end piece of white bread!
Hey guys, Joecap here, and yeah, I really shouldn't have gone there. I've had this theory sitting on my mind for a while now regarding one of my all-time favourite games, Xenoblade Chronicles. Objectively the best JRPG of our generation, don't at me. A vast, open game with a unique story which should really be seen to be believed. No, seriously, I've always been shit at advertising and there are going to be spoilers anyway. Anyhow, it's about Shulk, main character of the story, and has been my Smash main for over 4 years now. Before and after that release, I had wondered some of the things regarding Shulk's general persona and character, but ultimately sat on it because I wasn't quite as analytical as I am now. But then after seeing to a few things, replaying the game on 3DS, and writing a Twitter thread on the matter which I'll link in the description, with the promise that I give thoughts another day, I am giving you that theory in video form. So, is Shulk on the autistic spectrum, or is he just rubbed off on me coincidentally? Let's find out. Right, let's prep some obvious questions. How should I format this theory? I'll be mostly going over what signs Shulk has over the course of the game, as well as how other characters support him. I'll probably also go over some miscellaneous details towards the end of this video. A lot of it might be loose conjecture, and I could be completely wrong, or even completely contradict myself towards the end. Then again, so was Sans' Ness, and up until Toby Fox came out and directly spoke the contrary, nothing was gospel, so the fuck do I know? Also, and as I said earlier, there's going to be spoilers for Xenoblade 1 and possibly a bit of 2. But enough prattle. Action starts. Firstly, we should really go over what autism is. To quote the UK National Autistic Society, autism is a lifelong developmental disability that affects how a person communicates and relates with other people and how they experience the world around them. The triad of autistic characteristics are as follows: repetitive behaviours, difficulties with communication, and difficulties with social interaction, with other symptoms and signs of an autistic individual being pulled from a pool, with it being a spectrum. With that, I should preference something. When making this video, I'm not looking for where he lands exactly, or what type of autism Shulk has. He's more than likely high functioning with some form of Asperger's. Needless to say, I mean, have you seen what he does with that shit? But I'm looking more for which traits he has in this regard. Whether that spills over into other parts of the spectrum is a different matter. This, and expect me to use the terms obsessive and literal a fair few times in this video. Also, the triad is increasingly becoming a dyad due to the considered similarities in communication and social interaction. Make of that what you will as we go through this video. Oh, and to the people in Discord chat saying DSM-5 only, the sources I'll cite say basically the same thing. Like, what other conditions do you mean by better explained? Down syndrome? To say nothing of the overlapping autistic traits and other needs to begin with. That all being said, let's see how this relates to Shulk. First thing to note, in story order, is his job as a weapons researcher / scientist. According to various sites and sources I've looked up, those with ASD will more than likely have obsessive or weird interests. Not only that, but historical scientists such as Isaac Newton or Albert Einstein, both who happen to land on the spectrum, and savants tend to gravitate towards these kinds of topics without showing many, if any, of the physical signs. I would also bring up the notion that coders are the most sought after profession at the moment, but that's probably not relevant. An emphasis on weapons in a world where technology is somewhere between two very contradicting generations may not seem irregular in any way, but hang on a moment there, we have some details to consider. The first consideration is the beginning scene a year later from the Battle of Sword Valley, where Shulk is in the mech on Wreckage Scrapyard. Right from the word go, we immediately see him identifying two types of mech-on, as well as touching on properties and parts of these two makes. Why is this significant? It's information not necessary to the player, and it's never brought up again. It's because he and Dixon, his would-be father figure, seem to be some of the few people in the entirety of Colony 9 that would know the ins and outs of versions of mech-on in that much detail. Dixon of course using it to forge the anti-mech-on glaive for Dunban shown at the unfinished battle of the outskirts of Colony 6. Speaking of the relations between Shulk and Dixon, there's a few things I'd like to go over. To start, keep in mind this comment from Dixon to Shulk.
Shulk, you're spending too much time in the lab. Either that or rummaging for junk in the scrapyard. It ain't healthy for a kid your age.
On the one hand, this more than likely relates to the obsessiveness of the autistic condition, being that even Shulk acknowledges that he can catch some fresher air sometimes. On the other, why specifically that one scrapyard, if there is more than one scrapyard around the colony, that is? I'm not the only one who finds that bizarre, am I? Regardless, the fact that he's going after specifically mechon parts in that one area at all relates to the weird interest side of this quote. As we also know later in the game, Dixon was one of Zanza's disciples as one of the Trinity, and I'm willing to bet he feigned ignorance in his relationship with Zanza and what the Monado is like, so Shulk didn't suspect anything. Do I think that Zanza has anything to do with his condition? Not directly, but I'm willing to discuss that later down the road for some more abstract reasons related to canon. Speaking of the obsession with his research, there's the scene where Ryan carelessly tries to pick up the Monado only for it to briefly take him over and damage a few things in the room. As everyone is shaken, Fiora firmly asks Shulk why he's more concerned about the collateral damage in the room than her, to which Shulk drops this line.
You're not hurt, are you?
I'm just chucking around dead memes at this point, aren't I? Anyway, I bring this up not only due to the indication in priorities, but because of the way Shulk sort of smart-asses Fiora's question. And then when Fiora becomes a watered-down Stellar Vermilion, Shulk hesitantly disengages after misinterpreting her frustration. A sort of taunt to get bodied, if you will. Small attention for a sec, it's worth noting that while an autistic individual may favour avoiding social interaction, it doesn't mean that they are completely incapable of it. Similarly, Shulk is shown to be capable in the times he does talk with others, so for anybody to debunk me on the grounds that Shulk doesn't stutter any of his lines... Come on, y'all want to trash Immersion that badly? Directors wouldn't take lines like that, full stop. With that said, I'd like to bring up some other interactions with Shulk and Fiora specifically. First is this line in the heart-to-heart before the final battle on the Sunken Prison Islands post-Mechonis arc, where Shulk says this. I always get carried away when I fixate on one thing. It's a bad habit of mine. Whether it is Monolith Soft being aware of the nature of Shulk's character or some form of unlikely Japanese mistranslation, this is one of the smoking guns in my opinion. Obsession, fixation, whichever term you want to use is one and the same to me, and there's little doubt in my mind that most definitions would have a similar meaning. In this heart-to-heart, Shulk nakedly admits that he has obsessions of this kind, and for Fiora to imply that he does this 9 times out of 10 helps justify this too. There are isolated incidents where he doesn't have his head in the book, such as the camp scene around the Mechonis thigh that has its own hint that I'll get to later, but I digress. Another hint around Fiora, and by extension Charlotte, in regards to Shulk's condition is that of potential sexual ignorance, shall we say. See, Noggin made an excellent video a while back on whether Smash is about a person living with autism, which I'll link in the description. In it, he preferences a section where he basically states that autistic people either bloom sexually really late or really early.
But they do know that it has an effect. Effects such as starting to feel sexual feelings far below the normal age, or feeling them far later than the normal age. Some even never at all.
Admittedly, this might be a form of appeal to authority, and I'm probably stretching a bit more, but hear me out. For one, both Fiora, Homs and Mechon form and Charlotte have features on their body that are pronounced in their own ways. In the case of Charlotte, she clearly has one of the more standardly sleek bodies in the series, rocking at least a D cup, plus an exposed tummy button, and Shulk thinks nothing of her in that sense, partially because Charlotte is more attached to Ryan due to the similarities between him and Ghidorah. Fiora isn't too dissimilar in this case, specifically with the Mechon body pronouncing her breasts more intensely and with arguably tighter sides. I don't think Homs Fiora has a lot to do with this theory, mostly because the story is more fixated on establishing its main premise up until Fiora is assumed dead after the Mechon attack on Colony 9. Regardless, notice the scene on the fallen arm after Fiora recognises Ryan for the first time after the collapse of Galahad Fortress. In it, we get a top-to-bottom view of Fiora's body that is arguably from Ryan's perspective, while cuts back in the camera show him clearly checking Fiora out. Why is this relevant? Well, keep in mind the following. In one of the cuts, we see Shulk blink to the side of Fiora after Ryan says,
I can see.
and even then, Ryan's focus is on Fiora almost exclusively after recognising her, whereas Shulk has blinked both ways at least once, and even turns to him in the same scene to acknowledge what she's been through. I'm not going to say Ryan was ogling per se, but by comparison to Shulk, Ryan is easily far more aware, for lack of a better term, of female bodily features, partially down to being a year older and partially down to being more thick-headed. And before anybody mentions the kiss Shulk gave Fiora, that was more to wake her up after the crash, almost like a mechanical sleeping
Holy shit is a metaphor for Disney CG remasters!
On a slightly tangential note, I also think that the Xenoblade 2 DLC has one or two hints as well related to this late blooming, specifically around Mythra, of all characters. Compare certain post-battle quotes from Rex and Mythra, specifically the one where Mythra tells Rex to quit staring, and the one where she tells Zeke to go stare at Pandoria instead, to that where Mythra goes to ask Shulk about the Monada.
Do you want to stop staring at me, or what?
I wasn't looking, honest. You just keep entering my field of vision, is all.
Eyes front, Thunderdweeb. Go stare at Pandoria instead.
I'm just making sure the power of the Aegis is being used correctly.
Shulk, your sword. Is it really?
Yes. Everything you've heard is true.
It's alright. I don't need the details now. But one day, you'll have to tell me all about it.
Here, Shulk acknowledges what she's heard about it, only for Mythra to essentially say, "Okay, I don't need your life story, tell me another day." I bring this up as another example of Mythra's pronounced features that Shulk pays no mind, in comparison to Rex and Zeke, who clearly have their preferences sussed out by now. And no, I'm not referring to Mythra's nervous addressing or Zeke's purple lightning dream smasher when I say it. Seriously, that can be made up of about 6,500 different innuendos in and of itself. Hi Jim Sterling, viewers! Anyways, back to Xenoblade 1. Really, Ryan's character and the way he supported Shulk for most of his childhood could be another sign too. Luxon made an excellent video a while back on how Ryan isn't as stupid as you would think, link in the description, with one of the sections mentioning how he looked to get Shulk to open up about his general concerns as well as visions and what have you. After the fall of Galahad Fortress, Ryan also says this.
In the old days, Shulk was kind of frail. You know, like a little bunniv that gets bossed around by the other colony animals.
Now, what exactly does he mean by this? Does he mean emotionally, mentally, or physically? What if it's all three? Keep in mind this is at a time Ryan starts to doubt himself. Whatever the case may be, I think it makes sense given the type of character Ryan is. A character just brash and sarcastic enough, and yet is willing to come to an understanding with Shulk by as many means as need be. I say sarcastic as there is a scene in Machna Forest after Shulk meets Alvis, where Ryan teases Shulk for hanging out with an imaginary friend, to which Shulk takes him kind of literally and snaps back a little bit.
I'm not lying.
I bring this interaction up as certain other friends I have who are on the spectrum oftentimes have a tricky time interpreting sarcasm like the scene I just mentioned. I know that most of the game doesn't have much to be sarcastic about for any of the characters, but Shulk's response is by far the most firm. This even comes to a front where Melia comes round in the following scene where Ryan mocks Shulk for the bitch slap Melia gave him, and Shulk is obviously not too happy about it. There are even looser instances, such as when Shulk comes out with his motive for revenge against the Mechon, which surprises Ryan on the grounds of he would have said the same thing but not in the same way. It just makes a lot of sense, you know? Going back to Fiora's character, I also think that Shulk has a bit of a hard time interpreting certain feelings as well. Kind of odd given his much memed catchphrase, but whatever. I bring this to light as autistic people can often lack an ability to process empathy sometimes. In the camp scene on the Fallen Arm, Shulk says this as Fiora is explaining Maynard's use of her body as a vessel.
I hope she stays trapped, hijacking your body, treating it like it's her own.
I guess.
I say good riddance, and let that be the end of it.
Shulk is obviously angry that the one using Fiora's body wasn't actually Fiora. And then when Fiora goes to explain that there were other reasons for it, Shulk is left briefly scratching his head wondering what the reason was. I'm probably going to be talking in circles trying to explain this scene, so I'll let it speak for itself. Prior to the events of the game, one thing that I had noted is the fact that his parents took Shulk out on that exhibition in Valak Mountain prior to the events of the game, which I have to slam the brakes on. Like, what, was bringing small children out part of the job description? Did you find Shulk lining up tomes in colour order? Or were you that shit at finding a babysitter? Yeah, really fucking convenient that you happen to be Zanza's ideal vessel. On that note, I might have an explanation as to why Zanza had that vision of Shulk becoming his vessel. And yeah, it's Shulk's ASD. But wait a second, where would that be? I think the obvious thing to say is that assuming everybody bar Shulk that went to Osse Tower was neuro-neutral, Shulk had a unique mind that Zanza would find suitable. On the flip side, autism isn't a mental disorder, but a neurological one. So, wouldn't that contradict the point? Not quite. See, a means my parents have given me to think about my condition by is that of an operating system in a computer. You all watching this might think of mental abnormalities as a software thing and neurological as a hardware thing. But when you think about it, one can't operate without the other. You're more than likely not going to find Microsoft Word on a Linux OS, and I have no idea where I'm going with this analogy. Point is, any kind of quirk in Shulk as a person, be it mentality or whatever, would be fairly easy pickings for someone like Zanza. This, and Shulk was never someone to abuse protagonist privilege style tropes, otherwise he would have been able to solve every vision, he wouldn't have to spill their inner conflict to Alvis, and Saurian wouldn't have been Wolverine. People are going to say to that example, but more passage of fate, but there's no saying he couldn't defy that either. I mean, he does it anyway with a fucking replica, but hey, happens to us on the best of days. Also, keep in mind this line at the scene of the betrayal in the Mechonis core.
He appeared to live because I became his life force. That is until he had matured as my new vessel and become worthy of wielding the Monado.
Okay, let's pick apart the wording here. Firstly, what do you think he means by until he had matured? In my opinion, I don't quite think he means maturity in the traditional sense so much as someone that Zanza had generally grown quite comfortable with, as well as the cycle of destruction and recreation, the requirement of a host in which to dwell in, and yada yada etc. But what would those requirements be, really? This is where the second part of the quote comes in, and where he says, allowing me to truly awaken. As we know, Zanza is one half of Klaus, the scientist that was working on the Beanstalk alongside Mayneth, Galea, that then became the architect of the Xenoblade 2 universe after destroying the world. Here's what I think he means by truly awaken. I think the vision told him of a man that was similar to the way he, Klaus, used to be. Someone that would be considered at least a sort of intellectual with a similar disposition. And yeah, I know operating what is basically the ISS is a bit more marvellous than that of a home office, but I'll leave that where it lies. I would mention the use of Adam Howden as both forms of their VA, but that's mostly coincidental. Seriously though, Xenoblade 2 basically retconned Klaus to look like Juju, although that was more due to the symbolism of hubris. Anyway, I'm waffling right now. Klaus being a higher up on the Beanstalk project whose ego made him hit the fuck it button could be explained by a lot of things, but did we ever stop to consider how he found that position in the first place in combination with him choosing to make such a sharp decision? My point is that Klaus likely had a similar place on the spectrum due to the choice of actions and place on the projects, as well as Klaus and the Architect having what is essentially a split personality. I mean, how else do you think he managed to lock other workers out of initializing Ion? But I digress. I believe that both Zanza and Mayneth, in their quest to go from one vessel to another in order to survive, would want a host as close to their past selves on the Beanstalk as possible.
Fiora/Mayneth less so, mostly because Machina technology kind of forced Mayneth into a spare body that happened to be Fiora as a means to backstab Egil. But still, something to keep in mind. All of this, and why would Zanza obsess over Shulk to the point where he wants his body to dwell for what is stated to be the next millennium, as opposed to however long their corpses go for? And if you're still not convinced, keep in mind how close Dunban came to actually wielding the Monado before losing the use of his right arm. It's fairly obvious Dunban is neuro-neutral, and the fact that he had to father figure Fiora from like 12 due to the fact that their parents died in a Mechon attack says a lot from my eyes. I'm willing to bet if Dunban had any special needs, he'd probably be a recluse by the time he hit 25, given the circumstances. Speaking of Dunban, there are a couple of interactions with him and Shulk that I'd like to go over that support my theory a bit more. One of these being just before the entrance to the Bionis interior first time round, where Shulk says this.
It's about the Monado. I'd like to ask your permission to use it a little longer.
Now, be it other characters or players, I have to poke an eyebrow at why he would even ask the question. We know that Shulk has been far more optimal with the Monado than Dunban ever was, Dunban himself even points this out himself, and yet, he asks out of manners, maybe? Another angle of this? I can't remember which site said this, but another sign is that certain autistic individuals will often give an irrelevant or misinterpreted answer to the question they are given. And given the fact that Shulk brought permission up at what would be a rather random time, I get the sneaking suspicion this is a mistake he would make had he been asked the same and or a similar question. Granted, Shulk was never really shown to have troubles with this throughout the course of the main story, but there are certain heart-to-hearts, such as Sunrise in the Park, that have misinterpretable options in 3 of the 4 overall outcomes. The invite and thoughts about fishing come to mind here. If anything, the roots for heart-to-hearts can kind of chuck certain concerns about headcanon completely out the window. Not all, but the fact that it is there throws open a lot of options. While we're on the subject of Dunban, there's another interaction in Alchemoth after the fight on Prison Island. Here, Dunban says outright that Shulk and Fiora are basically inseparable, and he'd ship the two if given the chance.
What? But Ryan hangs out with her just as much as me.
Yeah, he does. But Fiora doesn't like him in that way.
I see 2 possible meanings to this interaction. A possible dissonance in relationships given the mention of Ryan's hot-headedness, or B, a connection to the aforementioned sexual ignorance mentioned earlier. I mean the latter in the sense that Shulk flinches in the scene where Dunban says that Shulk and Fiora should be together, and then when Dunban debunks his mention of Ryan, the way he says, "Oh, I see," could mean that he interprets the conversation in a few different ways. I would also point to direction and the take they selected, but to say that the matter of loose perception played any form of factor is to say Rex isn't Lightspeed. So, Gesundheit? Anyways, back to the main story. In the Apocrypha arc, there are two instances where he predicts attacks from Jadeface and Godot, despite the Apocrypha preventing him from having visions. Here's my question. Is it possible that this is some kind of pattern recognition in the frequency that we would generally have visions? Or maybe proximal and eidetic memory that are common to savants on the autistic spectrum? Another video by Luxin, the Monado Explained, touches on an odd free will argument where if our brains are exclusively just chemical activity, which for the most part they are, it's possible to predict the future given the similarities between IRL chemicals and ether. I know I've already sourced something that says autism isn't due to any chemical imbalance in the mind, but it's worth noting that the Monado, a tool that regulates the ether itself, mind you, is solidly a part of him by this point in the story. Apocrypha is only loosely related here until he was that deep into the Mechonis core, and inside the wrist of the fallen arm, he got the thing booted back up by sheer willpower anyway, so outside of preventing visions during cutscenes, it was never shown to really affect him up until paralysis in the Mechonis core became a thing. Regardless, the fact that he had this ability, be it if the Monado was compensating for him or not, throws up a lot of questions about how he was able to do so. On another note, Godot's relation with Sharla makes for a cheeky segue to another point I'd like to bring up. At the camp around the Mechonis thigh, Shulk mentions to Sharla the parts Mikol gave him, and that he can make a new rifle for her if she so wished. Sharla then mentions how she uses Godot's rifle for what we can assume are nostalgic or otherwise emotional reasons. Ryan even somewhat reinforces this notion, to which Shulk gives a rather neutral response. The way Shulk says "I guess so" strikes me as a kind of "I don't get it, but I'm sure you have your reasons" response. Notice how much more pragmatically Shulk processes an otherwise mundane social interaction as opposed to Sharla, who seems to care less about what's optimal and made a choice based on the memory of a loved one. I'm not saying Shulk is entirely oblivious to her plight, but the fact that he hasn't gotten the clue yet, as Ryan would put it, hints that he'd rather keep fundamental options open more than anything else. Similarly, I'm not saying Shulk doesn't care, he absolutely does. But it's the fact that Shulk isn't really willing to put himself in another person's shoes, as it were.
Before I forget, there was also the way Shulk handled Fiora's collapse before confronting Jadeface. After helping Fiora from falling completely over, noticed the perceived distance between him and the rest of the party when looking for a place to rest Fiora for a bit. I'm not being conspiratorial, am I? I've already touched on the way Shulk is given support by other members of the party, specifically Ryan, as mentioned earlier. However, there is a way that Fiora chips in that regard inside the Mechonis core. I'm referring to her saying this.
Listen, Shulk. If it's too hard for you to handle on your own, talk to me. Huh?
Fiora?
You can tell any of the others as well. We're all here for you. Don't forget that.
I would refer to how TAs are a constant presence over the shoulder of their disabled students, but I think that would be an exaggeration. Either way, the fact that she's giving Shulk the advice to lean on others a bit, especially given the slightly random timing of the line, implies that he has some kind of difficulty coming out to people about his issues. This much is obvious given the aforementioned role of Ryan and Shulk's more limited sociability. I don't even think she's referring to the paralysis he suffered, given that she saves that for another point in the scene. Moving past the Dixon Sansa betrayal and Shulk's revival at the hands of Alvis, there's the Telethia attack on Colony 6, only for Shulk's return to force them to retreat. The back and forth between Shulk and Dixon ending in,
"And we will be the best guests you ever had."
I can't help but paint as a bit of a mood swing. Not only is this the most unlikely response for someone whose smoking granddad just stabbed you in the back, but the fact that he stopped the rest of the party from going after Alvis, who got Shulk to come out about half of his issues while unconscious. It could just be a witty response, but then again, why would he come out with it if it's completely unlike his demeanour thus far? Going back to the subject of Dixon for a sec, Parakai made a video a while back discussing her issues with the ending arc of the game. In the section where she highlights the Dixon portion atop the sunken prison island, she mentioned how Shulk's struggle in this fight was less an emotional one and more where he doubted if he was physically strong enough. As mentioned with the implied mood swing, I think this might be due to a sudden dip in his mentality in general, as certain conditions often tend to do. That, and the fact that Dixon slapped him and 6 others might have something to do with it, but hey. At the end of the story, after slaying Xanta and ridding the world of gods, Shulk is shown to be on the other side of the beach to Ryan, Sharla, Ricky and Juju. As we know, those on the autistic spectrum often value their personal space and often have sensitivities in frantic social situations such as parties. In this case, it's Ryan failing at fishing and the three males being idiots. I don't think I should really have to explain this one given the signs that are there and what we've gone over. However, there are a couple of things to branch off of from this ending scene. First is the way Shulk slightly panics when Fiora, now returned to her Hom's body, asks what's up, inadvertently calling Shulk out for sparking off. Probably doesn't mean anything, but still. The second extra point I like to bring up goes into Juju somewhat. When Shulk and Ryan first meet Juju in the buggy he nearly wrecks, not only is Shulk shown to be a weapons scientist, but just so happens to be a mechanic as well on the spec of buggy Juju was driving. I might just find it coincidental that one of my own personal interests was to go from trains to cars at the age of, 7. But it also makes sense given the type of early found interest, which can include interest in mechanical stuff such as cars or trains, or something more general such as art or music. Given the slight shift in this niche interest that still regarded these similarities, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Shulk still happened to have knowledge in this field, even if it wasn't specifically motor vehicles. Oh yeah, and Shulk knows how to operate what might as well be a JCB in the time it takes Authorion to initiate a murder-suicide versus Zord and save him. Work that one out, I guess? Do we mention he's only 18 years of age? The final bit about Juju in general is that he's with the group that's playing on the beach, and given his somewhat impulsive nature when the player first meets him, I wouldn't be surprised either if Juju has autistic traits as well. Keep in mind how as the party gets closer to the end of Sartorial Marsh, Juju becomes more aware of himself and goes back to help Colony 6 rebuild itself. Now, normally this would be the end of the video, but I'd like to throw in some bonus rounds before heading off. When looking at the concept for this video, I literally did Google searches for the links between autism and atheism, given the whole world with no gods thing in the endgame. Lo and behold, the top 2 search results for do autistic people believe in God were links saying no. Huh. Admittedly, I'm not too familiar with the sites that said so, and Google's been kind of fishy lately with the whole good censor it made for China and all. Fucking authoritarians. I also admit that atheism and the message of a world with no gods isn't quite the same thing, but it's still food for thought. The final point I'd like to bring up today is this. In the Japanese exclusive Xenoblade The Secret Files Monado archives, there is a secret chapter that reads of events cut from the game that took place between the Telethia attacks on Colony 6 and the re-entering of the Bionis Interior. I'll leave a translation link in the description for those that want to give it a read, and so you all know that I'm not getting anything out of context. But there are specific excerpts that I'd like to focus on, being these. Then, outside, she saw a familiar shadow beneath her window, Shulk, who she thought was already asleep. Where could he be going at this time of night? He was so intent on his destination he didn't even realise she was there. Soon, he reached his researching room, and immediately began searching around the bookshelves, rifling through some old documents. Similar papers were scattered all over the room, must be continuing some research he had started earlier in the day. Shulk was a boy who took his responsibilities seriously. He always had to do what he felt was right. It was because of that Melia herself was still alive. His replica Monado project would save countless more people. Let me reiterate for those that missed that. Shulk is up at 2:30 in the morning, not only for the incentive of saving a friend from her mechanical breakdowns, but to go to these lengths for a project that he also has personal gain in for is possibly the best piece of evidence in this entire video. If this isn't the logical extreme of his obsessive interests brought to the forefront, I don't know what is. This has been Joycap, and let's hope I don't end up in another PR shit show.